Everyone. I'm Svetla Turnin, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of Cinema Politica here in Montreal. We're thrilled to virtually welcome you to an event inspired by Ashley O'Shea's fierce film Unapologetic, at a time when Black artists and activists are charging new pathways grounded in social justice and anti-oppression and inspired by the collective energy of social movements. We're especially honored to share with audiences a film that not only honors the voices of Black women fighting for justice and organizing around abolition in the US, but that is truly unapologetic on its own terms. So we're extremely honored to host our special guest tonight, Ashley O'Shea, director of Unapologetic, Charlene Carrados, and Marianne Lopez, as well as Ocean Jasor, who's graciously accepted our invitation to host the event. I'd like to thank our co-presenters and co-sponsors tonight. The Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University is generously co-sponsoring the event. And the event is also co-presented with the Coalition to Defund the Police, Montreal, the Collective Opposed to Police Brutality, Protests and Pedagogy, and COTV. We'd also like to send a big shout out to the folk at Kurtemkin Films, whose work we've been admiring for decades and we continue to screen. And of course, we'd like to thank our workers and our volunteers, as well as the amazing team behind the Zoom magic at Concordia University, and of course, the closed captioning team that will be providing closed captioning for the event tonight. We hope our events can still help you to stay engaged and inspired until we can gather and celebrate political activist cinema in the theaters again. In the meantime, please check out our offerings on Cinema Politica On Demand, sign up for our newsletters, and follow us on social media so that we can keep you informed about upcoming events. We begin this event by acknowledging that Cinema Politica's main office is located on the unceded lands of Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. We believe it is not enough to acknowledge the title holders of the lands where we live and work. Rather, we urge everyone who attends our screenings to become involved in anti-colonial and indigenous-led struggles and resistance in Tiohtià:ke and beyond. Tonight, we're hosting our event on the Zoom platform, which is headquartered on Mawekma Ohlone territory. We acknowledge indigenous stewardship, presence, and sovereignty beyond land and into these virtual spaces as well. And now a quick breakdown of the event. We'll start off with introductions, and then our guests will engage in a conversation about the film and their work for about 30 minutes. After that, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So if you're watching the event on the social media platforms, Facebook or YouTube, as well as here in the Zoom webinar, we invite you to send in your questions. We will be monitoring all the platforms and we will be channeling them to our guests tonight. And now I'd like to introduce our host. Ocean Jasor is a graduate of Florida International University and an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University. Prior to joining academia, she worked in development agencies broadly concerned with women's empowerment and gender justice. Her current research investigates present-day feminist movements and discourses in South Africa, the African continent, and the African diaspora. Her work was published in Gender, Place and Culture, Science, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, and Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies. Ocean, thank you so much for being here tonight. And now I'd like to pass the virtual mic to you.
Thank you so much, Svetla. Thank you for having me and calling me for this really great event tonight. I'm really honored to be part of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce some of our panelists tonight. First, we have Ashley O'Shea, who made this wonderful film. Ashley is a Chicago-based documentarian. She has produced work for a number of national brands, including Lifetime, Ford Motor Company, Boost Mobile, KQED, and Dr. Martens. Recently, Ashley's work also appeared in the critically acclaimed Lifetime docuseries Surviving R. Kelly. And Unapologetic marks Ashley's first foray into the feature world. So we'll be talking about that documentary, that film tonight. Next, we have Charlene Carrados. Charlene is a political strategist, a cultural worker, and a PhD student in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University. She's a practitioner of telling more complete stories, and her research includes Black feminist political economies, abolition of patriarchal and carceral systems, and the role of cultural work within the Black radical tradition. Charlene is also the founding national director of the Black Youth Project 100 and the author of the book Unapologetic, a Black, queer, and feminist mandate for radical movements. It's available in English and in Spanish. And last but not least, Marianne Lopez. She's a Black feminist activist and community organizer. She tackles issues surrounding anti-Blackness, gender-based sexual violence, and its intersections. She coordinated the intersectionality division for the Quebec Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers, where she did advocacy work and raises awareness on how gender, race, class, and ability intersect in the context of sexual violence. She has also organized with movements such as Black Lives Matter and Montreal Noir around issues such as racial profiling and police brutality. She's currently the co-vice president for la Fédération des Femmes du Québec, and she's also a program outreach coordinator at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. She's also the co-founding member of the Coalition to Defund the Police in Montreal. So thank you all for being here tonight. I guess I can now ask you to put on your camera so we can see your lovely faces. Thank you. So I would like to start by saying that watching this film was really brought all sorts of emotions. And thank you so much, Ashley, for making this film. It's important and it is timely. It's actually very telling that we are talking about this film today as we all witnessed the first day of the trial of Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, right? And so it brought up a lot of emotions. I cried, I laughed, I cursed a little, but most of all, I dared to dream about a world where transformative justice would prevail for all, but for Black people in general, in particular, sorry. And so before we start talking about all of the issues that this film raised, all the important issues, why don't we take a few minutes and hear from Ashley about her experience making that film? What led you to make this film, and please tell us about some of your experiences while making it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm just really glad to be here. I feel like I'm on a panel with like such heavy hitters, so I'm just I'm just glad to share space. So this film came about. I started in the fall of 2015. I had just graduated from Northwestern and had moved down to Chicago. And it was around the time that young Black people were continuing to organize around the killing of Rekia Boyd. So earlier that year, he had escaped any accountability via the judicial process. And so it was a time when a lot of young Black folks were just, trying to get any form of accountability they could for this killing. And so it was, first of all, if you were just like Black and in community at that time, like it was pretty hard not to know the work that folks were doing in that space. But there was a particular Chicago Police Board hearing, which is kind of like this direct forum between citizens and this like appointed police board that I went to. And, you know, after the kind of all pomp and circumstance of everything, like the organizers, Charlene included, actually shut down the space. And, you know, I was energized by the fact of what was happening in general, but I was also I was just noticing that a lot of the people that were being centered in the space and that were leading the chants were people that I could directly identify with as a young Black woman. And so I just began to think about and research like any comprehensive media about the movement about Black social movement from this perspective of Black feminism. And, you know, I came up short. And so that's when I actually think I reached out to Janaé and Charlene in the same email. And Janaé, you know, she showed an interest, and I found out she was starting her PhD program and was leading in BYP 100 as well. And I was just like, you're 24 and this is like a lot to be doing. And I was 22 at the time, so it was just like a lot. And so I began filming with her. And then over the course of that season, like so much happened. You know, the Laquan McDonald tape came out. The police superintendent was forced to resign. And so I think in those moments, I kind of just had this like realization that this was a lot bigger than what I had seen it more as a short film, just like a character piece about Janaé. But I was meeting more people in the community, and I just knew that this was like a special moment in Chicago. And so I wanted to contribute to this living archive because I, you know, like I said, when I was researching, I came up short. And so I didn't want people, 5-10 years from now to not be able to access this really important piece of history.
Thank you so much. And here we can all kind of contribute. One of the things that really caught my attention, really struck me in this film is how well it highlighted many issues that usually are quite invisibilized. So to be specific, as someone who studies social movements and black social movements and protest, right? Social movements in general are usually approached from a gender neutral perspective, right? And within Black protest and Black radicalism, gender, sexuality, class, all of those things that intersect, right, with protest are usually not talked about. And in my work, I see how crucial taking a gender perspective or an intersectional perspective is to studying social movements. It actually makes or breaks often social movements and Black radicalism. And so let's talk a bit, if you guys don't mind, let's talk a bit about the importance of analyzing what's going on, the type of radical movements that we are living through from a gendered, queer perspective, not just gendered and queer, but also intergenerational, right? That's one of the other topic that loomed large in this film is the difference in generation, right? The type of radicalism that young Black people and young Black women and young queer men and women are displaying. So can you guys, you know, jump in and tell me a bit about your experience as feminists with protest, radicalism, and what it means to finally look at social movements from that lens?
I guess I'll pop in. So I think it's important to note that what we're witnessing right now and what we see throughout the film exists in a lineage of work. Like Janaé and Bella Boz, excuse me, don't just come out of the thin air. They exist within the Black radical tradition and radical LGBTQ traditions, both in Chicago, across the country, and also globally. And it's important to, I think, say that to understand that none of this is new. We didn't just all of a sudden figure out how to talk about race, class, and gender and sexuality in 2013, 14, or 15. And my understanding of movement, particularly Black social movements globally, is one that while a gender lens has not always been at the forefront, it has always been present. And the Black radical tradition as a global tradition is reflective of people saying, be it, and I can talk, I can situate some of this squarely in the US, but it can also be broadened to talk about Sojourner Truth in her provocation of Ain't I a Woman, as an enslaved person, talking about being Black and woman, and enslaved, frankly, in the US, to Frances Beale talking about double jeopardy, Claudia Jones internationally talking about triple oppressions of race, class, and gender, as a Trinidadian woman who was exiled from the United States, to talking about the Combahee River Collective in the 1970s, talking about interlocking oppressions, and then getting to this moment where Kimberly Crenshaw coins the term intersectionality. And so there's a long tradition of Black feminists being clear that there is, that we, in order to understand the conditions of Black people and to also to develop solutions to transform our lives and transform society in our communities and globally, is understanding our lot, how we are impacted by these as Combahee River Collective would say, these interlocking systems of oppression. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice to think that this hasn't existed for a very long time, and to not to recognize the labor, both intellectual and cultural labor, of people who come before us. And there's a reason why our work is intergenerational. There's a reason why the folks in the documentary could articulate what happened to Rekia Boyd as state-sanctioned violence impacting her as a young Black woman. And so for me, that doesn't just, it doesn't just get us to understand identities, but it gets us to understand what values might come out of those experiences. And, I'm always talking about the Combahee River Collective and the Combahee River Collective statement, because when they articulated identity politics, they were clear that they were developing a material analysis of what was happening in the world through their lived experiences as Black women, including Black women who were also lesbians. And while white men in the US, white Christian men in the US have always engaged in the politics based on their identity, and their actions have been grounded in their identity, their power, and their privilege, Black feminists have created a different way, a different opportunity, a different way of being in the world that leads us towards collective liberation and not towards more oppression, suffering, pain, and death.
I guess I can chime in. First of all, I would just really like to thank Ashley for her work, her art. After watching this documentary, I felt so much emotion. I felt seen as a Black feminist organizer, because I totally agree with what Charlene is saying, that there's a long tradition of this type of organizing, of Black women being at the forefront. But here in Canada, what I've seen is there's been such an erasure of our contribution to these struggles. whether it be in feminist organizing or racial justice organizing, Black women have always been at the intersection of both, but we have been silenced, erased from histories and from conversations. And up until today, we see it recently, there's a lot of talk about defunding, abolition is gaining mainstream. It's, we're talking about it openly, but we continue to erase the woman, the queer folk that's behind years and years of work. And so I think what's important about this film is that Ashley, you in a sense, you pay tribute to this legacy of Black feminist organizing, and it's rare to feel seen and to feel that people acknowledge the work that's been happening, even if it's been erased.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly say, like, part of the incentive also for making Unapologetic was like, I selfishly felt like I needed to learn about, this Black radical feminist tradition. I hadn't, in my formal education, I wasn't taught about people like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ida B. Wells and all these people that were the backbones of so many Black social movements. But often never got the credit or got it in a very specific way, and so that was a lot of. I'm glad that it seems that is felt throughout the film, because we really tried to like imbue that tradition throughout the piece, and really, there's that whole section where we kind of like zoom out and talk about the genesis of the BLM movement and the Black queer feminist lens, and so it's really, I think, like Charlene said, it's been around for a very long time, but the fact that, in 2015 at the age of 22 was like the first time that I was really hearing about it and starting to understand it, I just found was problematic. And I really hope that this film can particularly touch a lot of just like young Black people, because I think, the earlier that connection is made and you start to understand how to approach it through this specific lens, the easier it is almost to build up more allyship and bring more people into the fold in a way that is not harmful or problematic to the movement.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to add that it's more than just highlighting folks that were always present, that were always contributing to the struggle, right? It's also very important because invisibilizing these people not only just change the very essence, the very fabric of a specific movement, but also its outcome, right? And we'll talk about in a second about organizing, but oftentimes in Black movements, Black power, Black movements outside of the US, outside of Canada, for example, in South Africa, where I do my work, a lot of the community building, a lot of the work that it takes to get a community together is actually done by women, by mothers, by queer people, right? And without that community building, it can be argued that social movements would crumble, right? Especially, I think, for Black movements that already, have to deal with all those axes of oppressions. To have a space where one is seen and that one can call family is so important. And so, Ashley, another thing that I clearly saw in the film was the importance of community building and organizing. Can we talk a bit about organizing for social justice, organizing for anti-carceral systems, having a sort of abolitionist organizing? does it look like on the ground, this type, and what does it take to build?
You want me to answer that first? I have a very brief answer. I feel like Charlene and Marlihan have better responses, but no, I think I got really lucky with this film that the two subjects I was following both, are self-proclaimed abolitionists. And I was just recently talking on another panel about how in this process, I had to unlearn a lot of what I had come to understand about policing and the systems that, so-called keep us safe. Through, talking to Janaé about her PhD and looking through the specific lens of Black women and girls. And Bella's just like her family's history with the prison industrial complex and how, that's the root of everything that she does. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting now in this moment where we're seeing a more broad conversation around police abolition and prison abolition and defunding the police. But these were all conversations that were happening in Chicago in 2014 and earlier. So I'm really appreciative of the fact that was something that's a blueprint that a lot of folks were already laying down, so that when this moment came in 2020 where we saw this even broader movement in terms of the movement for Black lives, that people already had the language for it and they didn't even realize that people have been working for years to bring that into the foray. But, Chicago organizers just be telling you like it is. So like there was no way to even, there was no way to be like objective, I guess, around that conversation, because like the work that so many people were doing in the film was rooted in abolition. So I felt like I would be doing a disservice if we didn't, center that. Reach slowly towards the mute button.
Well, all I could say is in terms of abolitionist work in Quebec, we have our own challenges. Anytime you do any organizing around systemic racism, anti-Blackness, or any abolition work, it's seen as Black folks trying to import an American phenomenon. And so we have to put a lot of energy in just shutting down that, that myth that police brutality, that anti-Blackness is a US phenomenon. And we have to like disengage and just organize, because if not, we lose a lot of time and energy just debunking that myth. And especially in the context of Quebec, which is, a Francophone province within an Anglophone, country, and their history in terms of class oppression, it's really hard to talk about any other type of oppression especially oppression due to race. There's a lot of influence from France, where, government does not want to acknowledge racial inequality. And so it's abolitionist work is challenging, but we're doing it. There's people that have been doing it before at the margins, with not a lot of resources or platforms to share this work, but now we're seeing a little bit more openness, but it's still really hard. It's still really hard because we're seen as trying to bring a problem that doesn't exist when, there are police killings. Black folks are dying at the hands of the police here in Quebec. Indigenous folks are dying at the hands of the police here in Quebec. So, we have our own struggles.
And think about like what I can add to this. I think it's important to consider like abolition of the prison industrial complex as, depending on who you're talking to, like the people who I learned it from are Black feminists. Like I learned abolition as a PIC abolition as a Black feminist like movement. intellectually, cultural, all of that. And so that's what grounded my understanding of it, as always having its roots in, and understanding like global systems. And so for me, like what it means to, in my experience in organizing, it is so much of what is both a challenge and an opportunity is telling as complete of a story as possible about what's going on and like on the local level in our communities and like nationally, and how we're connected to things and people transnationally. And that and I say challenge and opportunity because to me, I can apply an abolitionist like analysis and practice to settler colonialism like really easily. I see the connections there because here, the way that the United States functions and reproduces its power is through capturing people. Capturing people, erasing people, killing people. And in the history on this land has happened through the attempted genocide of Native peoples to this land and the enslavement of African people on this land. And so the prison is an extension of settler colonialism. It's a product of it. I think Dylan Rodriguez, who's an organizer and also a scholar, talks about how like saying police violence is actually redundant because all policing is violence. And he also talks about how mass incarceration is like doesn't even get us to where what we're really talking about, because incarceration and carceral stuff is like a part of what it means to be the United States of America. And so I think it's a hell of an opportunity in organizing for us to be able to talk about how all these systems are connected. And to me, like that is how we got more young Black people in BYP 100 to think about PIC abolition, because we are entangled in the prison industrial complex in so many ways. Even if we are like we come from Black immigrant families and Black migrant families, if folks are transgender, if folks are queer, disabled, like the tentacles of the prison industrial complex are so broad. And once we started to tell stories, and once we started to invite people to consider what safety actually looks like in their own lives and what safety could mean in their own lives, it just opened up doors. It's challenging because so many Black people here in the US are being sold this story that policing keeps us safe. And at the same time, knowing that it doesn't keep us safe, be it the policing that happens in our schools, in healthcare institutions, in faith institutions, and of course, the policing that happens just on our blocks on any given day. So it is, I found myself in many conversations with people like, what you mean? You want to abolish the police and prisons and surveillance and all this other stuff? To me, that's an opportunity to organize people into not just around the idea, but into taking action in their own lives, like right now. Like abolition is now. It's not just later. It is now, and it is later. And it is absolutely right now. People are practicing it and creating what it means in their everyday lives right now. And so, to me, that's the invitation that is possible for people who are actively working towards living in a world that functions without doesn't function with policing, prisons, and punishment.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to follow up a bit on that, even though that I see the time is flying, but the film starts with protesters going into cafe and restaurants, and this white man calling or talking to the police and saying, can you just get them to stop? We're just trying to have brunch. We all watch TV. We know what's going on. We're just trying to have brunch. I think that's the part where I started cursing. I cursed from the beginning. And I'd like to start with Marianne on that one because of her being in Montreal, I guess. A place, or in Canada, a country where usually racism is kind of, I've learned, swept under the rug. Oh, that does not concern us. That's for our neighbor, southern neighbors, right? Neighbor. What is your experience doing this type of work, especially with a slogan such as "Defund the police" in Quebec? I want to assume that you have encountered a lot of opposition and maybe misunderstanding. Can you tell us a bit about that? I mean, all of us, but Charlene has already started telling us about why this work is important, but what are some of the reactions? What have been reactions in Quebec?
Well, if you talk about when defunding went like mainstream this summer, a lot of times journalists, when they talked about it, they would just talk about taking money away from the police. So a lot of times what we had to do is, you know, provide like a counter narrative. Yeah, it's taking money away from the police, and it's also thinking about a world without police, but it's also investing in communities. It's also creating systems of care for our communities. So a lot of times, you know, when people talk about defunding, they don't ground it in an abolitionist framework. And that's where people, you know, are like, yeah, but who's gonna protect us? So if you don't ground it in an abolitionist framework, if you don't talk about, you know, what it means to have a world without prisons, without police, what it means to invest in, you know, education and housing and programs for youth, you know, of course, you're going to get a lot of pushback. But in our experience, when we take the time and we do a lot of, you know, popular education and we explain what we really mean and what, you know, abolition is and, you know, the framework behind, and the fact that defunding is just one strategy, people understand better. And we've been able to, like, there was a sondage, how do you say sondage? There was a survey that the city put out there, and an overwhelming majority of residents here in Montreal were for defunding the police. So I think what's needed is us to have the ability, you know, the creative mind to reimagine public safety, because I think that, you know, we've limited ourselves to what the state has told us what safety is and who can, you know, guarantee it. And our communities know that the police has never kept us safe, and they can't keep us safe. And so, yeah, I think through education, we can gain ground. And like Charlene says, you know, right now we have an invitation to share, you know, these experiences and this knowledge that doesn't, you know, wasn't invented yesterday. There's a long lineage, and I think it's a moment to, you know, take up that space and try to share this knowledge with others.
I'm unmuted. Okay, good. Yes, it is. I think this conversation is making me think of, you know, police violence in all corners of society, not just in the streets, right? Police violence in the streets, brutality in the street, yes, but disintegrating Black families, right? But also in the classroom. And part of my work with protest and pedagogy is to highlight these forms of violence in academia as well. In not just physical violence, but also epistemic violence and policing of Black students as well. So all of these things, I think, are important to talk about when we consider defunding the police. It's not just in the streets, in the communities, it's in every aspect of our daily life, I think. So Marianne mentioned that it's not just about taking the money away from the police, it's also building communities, better communities, right? And at one point in the film, when I think Janaé, is it her, when she goes to, I guess, a barbecue in
Bella. Yeah.
Yes. And she talks to this woman, and this woman says that what we need is leadership. We are lacking leadership. How do we build leadership? How do we, now that we understand how much is grounded, how much is needed from Black communities, how collective it is of an effort and not individualistic, like this, neoliberal capitalist society would have us think. It's such a collective effort. How do we foster these leadership skills, especially among young people? And in the film, I mean, we've seen so many young Black women active, doing so many things, PhDs and rapping in the street and caring for others and visiting family members in prison. So much work. How can we support these efforts, these attempts at becoming leaders? What does it take?
I mean, I think you just, go ahead, Charlene. Okay. I think you just hit on a lot of it. I mean, I think with the film in particular, we wanted to depict these two very distinct form, not very distinct, but just like the ways that Janaé and Bella are approaching it are different in terms of their leadership. And, we wanted to move away from this understanding of like the central male figurehead that we see a lot when we're talking about Black social movements, and, give space for spoken word artists and writers and orators and all these different types of identities that I was seeing in Chicago. We wanted to give space for, what that exactly looks like, in the hopes that when people are watching this film, that if they're thinking about, getting involved with the movement for Black lives, that they're considering, what is best that they can bring to a moment. I think a lot of times people think, oh, I'm not the greatest speaker. I don't like crowds, like X, Y, and Z. So this is why I don't want to join this social movement. But, through these two examples, and even me myself, like I saw this moment and I was like, yes, I could, take the sheets with them. I could, come into this community and see how I could affect change that way. But I also knew I had this skill as a filmmaker, and I knew that this film would come out a very particular way if it was told through a Black woman's lens. But that was something that I had to consider myself. And so I just encourage people to, think about what you're already good at, and figure out where in the movement you could find a space in a community, because that's what allows it to become sustainable, because there are going to be moments where you're very tired or things become very overwhelming. And if you don't love what you're doing, or you don't love your role in it, you can become very discouraged, and, that could cause less people to be in community and in leadership. But there's just so many ways. I mean, there weren't even enough minutes in the film to highlight, all the other leaders that we spoke to, and how they all just approach it in such a unique way.
Yeah, I appreciate what you just shared, Ashley. I think the way, just to add to that, it's by funding their work, supporting their work, and actually building relationships with people, and not just extracting from them, here's what you can do for me, and then that's it. It's showing up. If they have a court date, it's if they have children, making sure you have childcare at your meetings, and at your events. It is for sure citing their work when you're using their work, naming who inspires you, And I guess there's no other way to say this, but actually loving people, and love is an act of care. It is also an act of like treating people like humans and not people who are perfect, you know? And so if we're in a relationship, that's actually grounds for some sort of accountability. When and if I step outside of the values that I say I believe in, through my actions. And so I think leadership is also saying, like, not being liberal and saying when you disagree with someone, and having a conversation when you feel that they're doing something that goes against what they say they believe in and what we've all agreed to. Well, again, that can only really happen when you're in a relationship. Like, somebody dragging me on Twitter can't actually hold me accountable, but someone who I'm in a relationship with can. I can at least the opportunity is there, because I still have to choose to be held accountable for my actions and take responsibility for it. So that's what I think of when it's a whole list of things. I guess lastly, just valuing their work and valuing all kinds of leadership and not just one kind.
I would just add taking care of each other. Like what I've seen so many of us go through so much grief, and so many organizers that you see at the front lines, and then when they're going through grief and loss and you know, trials of life, there's nobody there. Then, you know, people just show up when you're in the front lines. They just show up when, you know, are on TV. But when you're, you know, when you can no longer do the work, sometimes we don't show up for each other. And I think that's something that we need to do a better job of doing, like caring for our organizers. And, you know, like Charlene said, love is also, it's the key. And in terms of my organizing, something I always try to, you know, to combat is respectability politics. It's something that is hurting our movement. And like, as an immigrant, I know that a lot of times we fall trapped to respectability politics because, you know, we wanna offer our families better futures, but, you know, we can't make it if we leave, you know, those that are most at the margins behind. So I think those two things are the most important things for me.
Thank you all. Before I ask you guys the next question, I would like to remind everybody watching that you can post your questions in the Zoom webinar or under the live stream on Facebook, right? Or YouTube. We will get to those questions in a few minutes. So go ahead, you can comment, you can put your questions while we are having this discussion. And I'd like to spend some more time on love, if you don't mind. Such a soft issue. As a scholar, something that is not highlighted a lot in scholarly works, academic works, love, right? The power of love. It may sound tacky, but so important for Black organizing. One of the things that the movie talked about, I mean, this film talked about so many issues within Black communities. But one of the issues that were brought up is the need for healing and the need for love and support from Black men to Black women, right? At one point, one of the protagonists of the film sings it, raps it actually, you know, I'm not gonna try that, but we need you. You know, we are here, we love you, we wanna free you along with us, but also we need you to do better. Like, how do we build those relationships of love within our own communities and heal this, the divide? Let's just face it. that unfortunately exists among Black men and Black women, oftentimes among Black women, among Black men. Do we need unity at all costs, or can this work be done without it? What does it mean to do this work without unity? It is very much a Black feminist tradition to emphasize the need for Black women to work alongside Black men, that until freedom is gotten for all, we will not be free ourselves. But oftentimes it feels that Black women have been at the losing end of this narrative. What do you guys think?
Depends on how you define unity.
Go ahead, define it for us.
I don't know if I have a I don't know if I have a definition. No, I think, I mean, one of my favorite moments or one of my favorite scenes that I filmed was when Bella was having kind of like her events for her new for Sister Survivor Network, and she was basically like, there were 3 of them. We just had the last one in the film, but it was really just a space to hold space for Black women that were particularly impacted by incarceration, but like in every single one of the events, there were so many, themes and topics that came up. But like what I realized witnessing that is that, like sometimes we just need to talk to each other. Like we need to literally be in physical space with one another and just like talk. And I don't mean that in a like kumbaya, like all we got to do is talk and we'll like, free Black people. But I just think there's just like a lot of misunderstanding, really. Like the moment that BLM came out of this killing of this young Black boy, Trayvon Martin, it grew over social media, and the ways that we connect around it is just like very digital sometimes. And I think, that is useful in some contexts because it has allowed it to grow beyond a reach that we ever could have imagined, like before technology. But we aren't taking the time to sit with like our elders or even people from our own generation to talk about how these issues are impacting us. Like, I could have been in that space with a lot of those people and not even known that a lot of them were dealing with family members in prison or fathers in prison or mothers in prison. And, once you kind of have that understanding, you can understand, how their opinions have been colored by their experiences. And sometimes like we can just become so lofty in our conversations, or our language can become so, I guess, elite, for lack of a better word, that I think like folks that are being most impacted by this issue they aren't given the space to have a stake in this. And so, I think we have to move away from this assumption that when we talk about abolition and the prison industrial complex and all of these really big words, that sometimes people just, they might act like they know what's going on, but they don't know what's going on. And so we really need to make space for people that are most impacted by these issues, because, at the end of the day, it's going to really, despite how we feel and think about it and what language we create, like it's still going to affect them, and we have to make space, even if it takes some time and causes us to slow down so that we can connect.
I think on the subject of unity, I oftentimes turn to Audre Lorde, Black lesbian feminist, who poet, teacher, writer, all those amazing things. And one of the things that she said a lot of things that people oftentimes like quote her, but one of the things that she says is that we do not have to become each other in order to work together. And she wrote and talked about so much about how we could do work across difference, and that we could be aligned with one another without all thinking the same, being the same, or necessarily even doing the same things. It was important for people to value our differences. And she wasn't talking about differences in like, across like whether or not you think I'm human or I deserve to live in dignity. She's talking about differences in like life experience, differences in identity, for sure. And so I'm not one to believe that we can stop at the conversation about divisions in our community. I think the conversation has to go there and beyond there to talk about what has created what is happening in our communities, because even divisions is like an incomplete way of thinking about like what is happening here, and not even if it's not incomplete. To me, it doesn't fully capture what's happening, like the violence that we experience amongst each other, the erasure that Marlihan, did I pronounce your name right?
Marlianne, but it's okay.
Marlianne, my apologies. Marlianne talked about earlier. All of those things, like they come from a place. And I'm not one to say that colonialism and chattel slavery created patriarchy amongst Black people, because that's not true. What I can say is that it absolutely created exacerbated and created like what we have today in our communities when it comes to like how patriarchy shows up through violence, through erasure, through overall oppression, all that stuff. And so I'm less concerned about us all being on one page. That's not my goal, for us to all be on one page. Unless that one page is that we are all committed in our various ways from our various locations to collective liberation for all. And that whatever the work it is that we do, it doesn't reduce or strip away access to full dignity. And it for sure, ideally will expand our collective access to dignity and be in the right relationship with each other. That's what and I think the unity language is something that oftentimes use for people to just shut the fuck up. Because we just need to all be we all need to be on one accord. And your issue, not now, your issue will come up later. No, what would a unity look like where no one is like required to be sidelined? And that's different than I think the popular conversation about what it means to like do work together and be with one another.
Absolutely. Yes, Marianne.
I'm just going to add one or two words because Charlene said it all. I think unity can only come if we center the margins, because a lot of times this discourse on unity has been used and been deployed to erase, shut down calls for acknowledging discrimination against our LGBTQ community, against, when we talk about misogyny in our communities, it's when we talk about different issues that affect all members of our community, but especially members that, come from minority communities within the Black community. So it's like whenever I hear unity, a lot of times I'm scared because it's usually used and deployed to shut down those necessary conversations. But, I do believe that we could achieve unity by centering the margins through education. And, I think a lot of us need to unlearn so much that, has been like the education that we've received. Me personally, it wasn't long ago that I had to unlearn so many things that, either I learned in school or at church or elsewhere. So I think we need to give each other the opportunity to unlearn and learn, but it's important that we don't use the unity, the unity discourse to shut down necessary, demands from people in our community that have suffered, usually silently, violence.
Yeah, I do agree that historically, Black women have been asked to just set aside their specific gender demands just for the benefit of the common struggle, and that has backfired in many ways. And I do believe that it is an anti-colonial tactic in order to, according to me, get to the next stage, post-colonial stage, is to struggle together for common goals, while at the same time being able to also point out the problems within our own communities. And as you all said, not necessarily, show a united front at all cost, while, marginalized groups within that community are suffering and erased and sometimes killed, right? And that's the fate of still many women, of many members of the LGBTQI community within our own Black community. And I really appreciated, Ashley, that this film did not give a monolithic approach to Blackness. It showed Blackness in all its glory, in all its pain, but also all its complexity. And without bashing each other, just simply calling it as it is, we have work to do. And so I would like to wrap up this conversation, this great conversation, I guess, with this note of hope that we are moving forward, that these conversations have actually achieved a lot, not just legally or in terms of policies. That is still actually lagging, if you ask me, but in terms of awareness, pride, community, love, it has done wonders, I think. Any word of closure that you guys would like to say before we go to the chat and answer some of the questions from the folks out there?
I just would like to show appreciation to Ashley for using art to tell our stories. And not everybody's going to come to an organizing meeting, or not everybody lives in a place where there are a bunch of like Black-led organizations, organizations that are like centered around Black liberation and using what BYP 100 calls the Black queer feminist lens. Like you don't necessarily have access to that. And so by putting it on film, it opens up opportunities for people to see what's possible and to also connect to the work that they're doing themselves already, and know and perhaps see how they are not alone in the way that they think and in the work that they're doing. And that, like, wow, this is an example of work. The film shows us examples of what's happening in Chicago. We also know that there are Janaes and Bellas across the world doing this work. And so that is the power of film. That's one of the powers of film, is to invite people into seeing themselves and seeing other people in more robust ways than, hell, I wrote a book about movement, but everybody's not going to read that book. You could spend the time watching this documentary and glean a number of the things that I wrote about in my book, Unapologetic. And so I find great value in people creating in what Ashley has created, and people using visual art, and particularly the art of documentary, to tell our stories in order to like fuel our movements.
Thank you all. Thank you. Anybody else? Ashley? Yes, go ahead.
I was just gonna I was just gonna be like, Charlene, I'm gonna send them to go read your book after they watch the film. Could be a double header. But no, I echo everything that Charlene said, and yeah, I'm just grateful that, there were a lot of times where I did not think this film would be done or ever be complete. But I just, if you've ever been in Chicago and just around the organizing community, I just felt like they deserve their due, and I'm most hopeful when other organizers watch this film and they can see themselves in it, because I know how much of an uphill battle it can be sometimes to even stay in the work. And so, you know, if it allows somebody a moment of respite or reflection, whether it's watching Chicago organizers or just remembering your own work, you know, then I feel like the film is doing what we always wanted it to do. So I'm just grateful.
Thank you, thank you. And in the words of Bell Hooks, I think it is, I'd like to just say that feminism is not something, she said, feminism is not something that you are, feminism is something that you do. So thank you, Ashley, for doing it. Thank you, Charlene, and thank you, Marianne, for doing feminism. Thank you. I'm going to now look at the questions that we have, ask a few questions. We are way past our time, so Nantali asked of Marlihan, anti-police brutality movement in Quebec has been almost exclusively white. Has that changed now?
For sure, for sure. Maybe scholar anti-police work has been mainly white, but there's been organizers organizing against police brutality, you know, for abolition for a long time. It's just, once again, you know, their contributions have always been erased or foreshadowed, but, you know, this is nothing new. Right now, we have Black orgs contributing to the coalition to defund the police, but even though the coalition is new, this work is not new. And, you know, Black people in Montreal have been resisting forever. It's just, you know, it hasn't been documented enough to, you know, give it these movements justice.
Another question from Duan Trang Pan, and I'm so sorry if I just butchered your name. I think Duan Trang Pan says, I feel good to hear you in this conversation. Can you share your thoughts on how we can work together efficiently for BLM and stop Asian hate? Thank you. I think it's an important question given the times we are in, right? How do we work together with other organizations of people of color?
Oh, was that for you?
Nope.
Oh,
no,
okay.
that you got it.
One thing that Ashley chronicles in the documentary or the film is, like, as mentioned, is the campaign calling for the firing of the police officer Dante Servant who killed Rekia Boyd. And what you see in there is, or what you, what's important to know about that campaign is that it became a multiracial coalition campaign. I remember the night one of the nights that we or maybe it was the night that we shut down the meeting at the Chicago Police Review Board hearing. There were representatives and members from organizations across the city of Chicago there that night. And they were not all there the first meeting or the first hearing that we went to, but through the momentum and through the relationship building that was happening in Chicago, it became a citywide effort. There were people from Asian American groups, folks fighting for Palestinian liberation, people from the from the labor movement, people from all sorts, from the Latinx communities in Chicago, people from all sorts of spaces and places in Chicago joined that campaign, joined that effort, and that was the result of organizing. And so, in this particular moment where anti-Asian racism is becoming a part of like more popular conversation in the wake of mostly Asian and Asian American women being slaughtered in the Atlanta area. First of all, it shouldn't have had to take that. But we know in the US, that's oftentimes it takes a mass act of violence for people to pay attention. We know that there has been work within Asian American communities in the US for a very long time, fighting back against xenophobia and specifically like anti-Asian discrimination and racism. And so it's bigger than just hate. It is literally systemic, what is happening. And so how we work together matters. And it matters that particularly for people who are in multiracial coalitions, to have a commitment to like noticing how systemic oppression shows up in our own work. So we're in our own space. So we're going to work together. How are you fighting against anti-Blackness? What's your analysis of anti-Blackness? What is your analysis of Native and Indigenous erasure? What is your analysis of Orientalism or anti-Asian racism? All those things. Like, how are you actively combating against that in your organizations and in your communities? Because if you're not doing that, to Marlianne's point earlier, we can't just come together just to come together. But what work are you doing to address like how these problems are already showing up? And if we can come to the floor, to the table, or to the room with like understanding where we are, what we need to work on, that puts us in a much better position to work in coalition and work across communities, in my view.
Okay, can I move on to the next question? From Julia Ovanpair. She asks, what are some opportunities to get involved in the defunding police movement as a member of the local community in Montreal? I guess that's for you, Marlihan.
So you could contact us. We have a Facebook page, Coalition to Defund the Police. I don't know if Stefan, you can put the links in the chats or in the. If not, we have also a website, so you can contact us, and for sure you can get involved.
Great. I will let that be our last question. I would like to remind everybody that you can still register on the Eventbrite event to receive a link and watch the movie. So even though the conversation is done, but you can still watch the movie. You can still go ahead and register. So go ahead and encourage people to watch the movie. It's such an important movie. I think that I'll wrap up here. It's 8:22. Thank you all so much for this great conversation. Thank you to the folks watching us on their computer, at home, globally. I know for a fact that we have people from, I'm not gonna say all over the world, but at the very least, Canada, the US, South Africa, the Caribbean. Thank you for showing up, and let's just continue this work all together. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.